on Friday, the expropriation bill was gazetted. This sets out the plan for land expropriation and the laws governing how compensation will be paid or will not be paid. Once passed into law, it will replace the 1975 Expropriation Act, and it should be more in line with our Constitution. Well, to tell us what it means, I'm joined by Professor Ruth Hall of the University of Western Cape's Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies. Hi there, Prof. So there's so much emotion around the phrase land expropriation without compensation. What actually does this bill set out around the issue of not paying for land?
Sally, thank you. Of course, what this bill says is that the state may expropriate property, and when doing so, compensation must be just and equitable. In fact, Section 12 of this bill quotes verbatim from the current wording of Section 25 of the Constitution, which we commonly call the Property Clause. So the wording is quite consistent with our current framing of the Constitution. It doesn't say how much compensation must be paid, but it explicitly says that where compensation is to be paid, it must be just and equitable. But it then goes on to clarify that where it is just and equitable for the compensation to be set at nil, in other words, zero, then that may happen. And it includes certain illustrative examples of when that could happen.
My understanding, one of those examples is that if it's land that is currently not being used, it's not planned for development and it's totally vacant. Is that correct? And what are the other situations where land may be considered for nil compensation?
Okay, what the bill says is that the compensation may be set at nil in cases where the land was fraudulently acquired, where it's held purely for speculative purposes, where there's a labor-tenant claim, in other words, where the owner doesn't have use of that property as a whole or a portion of it. But they're very limited cases. So I think that what this is going to happen is that this bill falls very far from the public expectations of what expropriation without compensation is understood to mean. It certainly does not offer the nationalization of land that some people are wanting. What it's offering is, in fact, confirming what has always been the case, which is that the state may expropriate. But it's bringing our legislation in line with the Constitution, as it was agreed in 1996, by saying not only can the state expropriate for public purposes, like to acquire property for public infrastructure, but also to compulsorily acquire property from one private owner to transfer to another. So, in a sense, this is confirming the 1996 agreement. It's well within the bounds of our existing constitutional framework. The difficulty, of course, I think for many people now is why are we changing the Constitution and bringing in a bill which is about trying to give effect to the Constitution that is currently up for debate?
So why do you think? Because I don't have a clue.
I think that firstly, Sally, I think that what has really happened is that the term expropriation without compensation has been much abused. It's come to mean different things to different people. And of course it is a political football. I think there's a real issue here, which is that the state has chosen not to use its expropriation powers for many years. It hasn't brought in the legislation that it should be using. But the reason land reform hasn't moved ahead is not because we don't have the right bill, it's because government has chosen not to use its powers. I think that the main thing to say now is that this expropriation bill can go ahead. It's been passed by the state law advisors. It confirms that the minister, this is the Minister of Public Works, can delegate authority to various organs of government, including local government, to expropriate. It gives owners of property who are facing expropriation an opportunity to respond within 20 days, giving their reasons of why this should not happen or rejecting the compensation that is offered. And there is always recourse to the courts. But I think that government has missed a trick in two ways here. The one is that they haven't actually clarified from a policy perspective how compensation is going to be approached. And I think that's what everyone wants to know. Is government going to try and pay no compensation and push and test the courts? Or are we wanting to keep with what government has chosen up to now, which is to pay market price? So we have no policy framework. So in a sense, this legislation comes actually from Minister Patricia de Lille, but it comes in the absence of a clear policy framework from Minister Toko Didiza to say, here's how I want to use these powers. The second thing is that I think that government has missed a trick by pushing this expropriation bill ahead of the constitutional amendment. We know that the Parliamentary Ad Hoc Committee has recently been reconvened to look into clarifying the powers of the state to expropriate without compensation. Again, this is the ANC formulation. It's not the EFF formulation, which is for nationalization. It is the ANC formulation, which is on a case-by-case basis. We will decide whether it's fair to compensate fully at market price or not at all, or somewhere in between. It is that government is now showing us it has a tool, but giving us no clues as to how it wants to use that tool.
Do you think that it will appease investors? Do you think that it certainly sounds like those who expect nationalisation of land will be disappointed by this bill if it passes? Do you think it'll appease investors? Do you think it'll appease farmers who are scared of having their land seized?
Yes, I think it will. I think that it provides a great deal of certainty. It provides a very, very strict process. If anything, I think what it's going to do is that when government does want to expropriate, it is going to provide a lot of certainty around proper process. That's what it sets out. It does not address a political demand, and I think that's what we saw in February 2018 when the EFF proposed in Parliament for a constitutional review process. The ANC then supported that. But of course, that always meant different things by it. I think people are going to be disappointed because what we haven't had yet is a political response to that demand. And I want to mention the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture that I served on looked into this. We were particularly convened in September 2018 to give far-reaching, overarching policy direction. And we made 31 far-reaching recommendations, of which fixing the expropriation legislation was just one. So I feel it was very disappointing that when the Interministerial Committee chaired by Deputy President David Mabuza and consisting of 6 cabinet members, had the media briefing yesterday on Sunday, that the only item that was addressed was this expropriation bill. I think everyone is wanting to know, well, does government have a plan going forward with land reform, or are you just showing us that you now have this power? I think it's actually disappointing, and I think the public needs to be told, here, government has heard you, and here's what we're going to do, and we're not hearing that yet.
Professor, I cannot let you go without asking for a comment. The President, in his letter this morning, spoke about what happened at Senekal last week, where a young farm manager had been brutally murdered, and then the farmers protested violently outside the court. What is your take on the dynamic on our farmlands at this time? Is it getting worse?
Sally, it's so hard to comment on, and it's not a field that I do research in. And I think that a lot of the discussion is fueled by particular brutal stories. And to actually uncover the extent to which are these generalized, are they getting worse, are they getting better? And years ago, there was actually a commission of inquiry by the South African Police Service to look into whether there was a particular campaign, a coordinated campaign across the country of farm murders. And it found that there wasn't, and that actually what we're looking at is generalized high levels of violence in situations of great inequality. It also pointed out that while a lot of the violence meted out against white farmers gets a lot of attention, violence against farm workers less so, particularly when it's within communities. For instance, violence against women on farms gets less attention than violence against white farm managers. But that said, the extent of and severity of the brutality is always shocking. So it is a controversial issue, but I think that others might be better placed than I am on it.
Well, thanks for your views. We appreciate it. Professor Ruth Hall, the University of Western Cape's Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies. Still ahead.